Commander Cale Arkin stood at the edge of the shattered command center, the hum of the emergency lights buzzing above him like a swarm of angry bees. Through the cracked viewport, Earth's horizon glowed dimly, suffocated under the weight of the alien invasion. He clenched his fist, fingers biting into the metal of his pulse rifle as a shiver of dread crawled down his spine. The alien fleet stretched across the sky, dozens of monstrous ships, each brimming with death, descending like vultures. A cold wind from the opening blasted through his fatigued face. 5 minutes, Lieutenant Kira Solis's voice crackled in his earpiece, sharp with urgency. "We're out of time, Commander. If you're not here in 2, we won't make it." Cale didn't need to hear her words to know the truth. The countdown was merciless. Humanity's final hope rested on a thread of steel, and that thread was thinning by the second. He had fought through countless battles in his career, but nothing compared to the stark terror he felt now, watching Earth on the brink of obliteration. Cale didn't respond immediately, his gaze narrowing at the looming ships overhead. These aliens, the Valor, had been on a relentless march across the galaxy, and Earth was their next conquest. Every word, every order he'd barked over the years now seemed insignificant in comparison to what he faced in these final moments. This wasn't about command anymore, it was about survival. "Commander, are you listening?" Kira's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. "We're ready to make our move. If we're going to disable their defenses, it's now or never." "Understood." He finally spoke, his voice steady despite the panic gnawing at him. "I'll be there. Just hold tight." He turned sharply, striding toward the escape tunnel that led to the rendezvous point. The walls shook as explosions reverberated through the compound. A part of him wanted to remain in the command center, directing the troops, but he couldn't afford to waste time. Every second brought them closer to humanity's extinction. Kira, his most trusted officer, was the heartbeat of their squad. Always the first to throw herself into danger, always the first to demand more of herself. A part of him had always admired that about her, her willingness to sacrifice, to do what was needed. But as he neared the hangar, he couldn't shake the memory of her family, lost to the Valor's previous conquests. Her resolve, hardened by grief, was dangerous. It pushed her to take risks no one else would. She had sworn to him she'd kill every last alien in sight, and he knew she would. The heavy metallic doors slid open with a groan as Cale stepped inside the hangar. The dim, flickering lights barely illuminated the makeshift transport ships they had hastily scavenged. Sergeant Jonas Riker was already seated at the controls of one, his hulking frame crouched in the cockpit like a bull preparing for a charge. "Commander," Riker growled, his voice low and rough from exhaustion, "you're just in time. We've got a clear shot at their defenses, but it won't last long. We breach, we fight, and we destroy their shield generator before they realize we're here. Any delay, and we're dead." Cale gave a curt nod, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. His eyes swept over the soldiers loading the last of the equipment, fuel canisters, explosive charges, and enough ammunition to keep them alive for what they all knew would be a desperate battle. Riker was right. The invasion shields were the only thing keeping the Valor fleet from raining fire on Earth's surface. They had no choice but to destroy it, or else. Kira emerged from behind a crate, her dark hair swept back into a tight bun, her sharp green eyes focused and unreadable. She didn't need to say anything, her presence spoke volumes. She knew this mission could be the end. But then again, she had accepted that long ago. "We ready?" Cale asked. "We are," Kira responded, her voice tight with determination. A sudden roar from above made them all freeze. The skies were coming alive with enemy ships, their silhouette dark against the clouds of smoke rising from the dying cities below. Time was running out. Cale didn't flinch. "Riker, get us airborne. We'll hit them from the east side and move in under the radar." As the transport lifted off, Cale's heart pounded in his chest. The ground below disappeared into a haze of dust and debris, but he could still see the alien fleet's vastness, their sheer number. His mind wandered back to the first time he had met the Valor. They hadn't been as savage then. There had been talk of diplomacy, peace. Now, that seemed a lifetime ago. The Valor hadn't changed, they still saw all others as weak, unworthy of life. And humanity? To them, they were nothing more than insects to be crushed underfoot. Cale clenched his jaw, eyes hardening as the words slipped past his lips, barely above a whisper, "We'll show them what humans are made of." The transport zipped through the broken sky, weaving between falling debris and smoke trails. The final battle was upon them. No one knew if they would survive this strike, but Cale was certain of one thing: humanity would never kneel to these invaders. Even if it cost every last drop of blood. The silence in the cockpit was deafening, broken only by the whine of the engines. Each passing second brought them closer to the unknown, the heart of the Valor fleet, and the last hope for Earth's survival. As the countdown echoed in Cale's mind, his grip tightened on his rifle. It was now or never. The transport lurched violently as it entered the perimeter of the Valor flagship's defenses. Cale's knuckles turned white around the controls, his heart pounding against his ribs. The city below was nothing more than a blur of fire and smoke, but the sight of the alien fleet above, impossibly massive, had his mind reeling. Earth's final line of defense was breaking apart. They were the last hope, and even that felt like a fragile thread. "Brace for impact." Riker's voice boomed over the comms. The transport veered sharply as a barrage of laser fire tore through the space where they had just been. Sparks erupted from the hull, a blinding flash of light. The ship rocked sideways, sending the crew stumbling across the interior. "Hold it steady," Cale barked, regaining his balance. He could feel his pulse in his throat, but he forced himself to focus. This was no time for hesitation. Earth's fate was pinned on this reckless assault. Kira gritted her teeth beside him, her eyes locked on the radar. "We've got incoming. The Vala know we're here. We don't have long before they unleash everything." "We'll make it," Cale replied, his voice steady but his hands gripping the controls tighter. "Take us through the secondary channel. We'll bypass their first line of defense." Riker's sharp gaze flicked to the control panel as he nodded, fingers flying over the buttons with practiced ease. "Secondary channel, aye. But don't expect us to dodge their whole fleet. Once we're through, it's all up to the ground team." The transport dipped sharply, dodging another volley of fire. The roar of the engines thundered in Cale's ears, and he winced at the vibrations coursing through the ship's frame. A sudden blast sent the hull screeching in protest, and a warning light flickered on the dashboard. The ship was losing altitude. 5 clicks to target, Riker announced through gritted teeth, his focus unwavering. "We'll be in range in 3 minutes. Everyone, get ready." Cale glanced over at Kira, whose jaw was set in a firm line. She had been through countless missions, but this one felt different. There was a darkness in her eyes, an unspoken understanding that, for all their training, none of them were guaranteed survival. And yet, there was no question. This was their moment. Earth's last stand. The ship jolted again, this time far worse than before. The warning systems flashed in every corner of the cockpit, but Cale's focus was razor-sharp. "Hold it together, Riker," he muttered under his breath. "I've got it," Riker grunted, flicking a switch. A heavy thud sounded beneath them as the transport's hull restabilized. "Let's go." The view outside the viewport had turned into a nightmarish landscape of enemy ships, hovering like dark monoliths in the sky. They weren't alone anymore. The Valor fleet had shifted into full battle mode. Cale could see their weapon systems powering up, massive cannons locked onto the trajectory of their transport. "We're gonna have company," Kira muttered as a new swarm of enemy ships broke off from the fleet, closing in on them at breakneck speed. "And they're not here to chat." "I see them," Cale said, eyes narrowing as he reached for the weapon system controls. "Get ready to move fast. Riker, hit the turbo and get us through that gap." "Turbo engaged," Riker replied, his voice steady despite the incoming fire. "Hold on." The ship shot forward, engines roaring with a violent thrust. The transport rocketed toward the opening in the Valor defense shield, the crackling of laser fire echoing in Cale's ears. Every shot that missed them seemed to just barely graze the ship's edges, sending sparks flying into the void. Cale's stomach churned with the force of their rapid acceleration, but he refused to look away from the approaching barrier. "We're not gonna make it," Kira breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We are," Cale said through gritted teeth. "Trust me." With a final, defiant roar, the transport punched through the gap in the defensive grid. Cale's breath caught in his chest as the ship barely slid between two Valor dreadnoughts. For a split second, he thought they might be crushed, but then, they were free. The endless void of space stretched before them, a cold, unforgiving expanse. They had made it. Target acquired. Kira's voice broke through the silence, her tone still sharp. She tapped a series of commands into the console, setting the course for their destination. Shield generator in 5 clicks. Cale exhaled sharply. "We've got a straight shot. But no more mistakes." Jonas's low voice rumbled from the back of the ship. "I've got a bad feeling about this." "You and me both," Kira replied without turning. Her hand hovered over her sidearm, ready for whatever might come next. A flash of light exploded behind them, and Cale whipped around, eyes darting to the rear view. A smaller alien craft had broken away from the fleet and was hot on their tail. "Damn it!" Riker swore, his fingers flying across the controls. "Brace for impact. They've locked onto us." The transport shuddered as enemy fire hit their rear shields, making the ship groan under the strain. Cale's heart slammed against his chest. They were running out of time, and they were nowhere near the generator yet. Every second spent fighting for survival brought them closer to failure. The comms crackled to life again. "Commander, this is Major Dunn," a voice came through, strained and urgent. "We're on the ground. But we're taking heavy fire. We won't hold long." The weight of those words hit Cale like a hammer. They had no choice now. The clock was ticking. "We push forward," Cale growled, eyes steely with resolve. "For Earth." And with that, the battle truly began. The ship trembled violently as another wave of Valor fire raked across its shields, the screeching metal beneath them sending vibrations through Cale's bones. His hands were clenched so tightly around the controls that his fingers ached, but he refused to loosen his grip. They had made it past the initial line of defense, but the worst was still to come. The Valor were nothing if not relentless. "We're losing altitude," Riker's voice was grim, his eyes glued to the rapidly blinking dashboard. "Shields are at 40%. One more hit like that, and we're toast." Cale swallowed the lump in his throat, his gaze flicking toward the rearview as enemy craft streaked toward them. "We can't afford to slow down now. Kira, prep the team. We're landing in 2 minutes." Kira, always the calm in the chaos, was already moving to the rear hatch, her expression resolute. "Understood. If we don't make it to the generator, this whole mission falls apart. I'm not letting that happen." A low hum reverberated through the ship as the remaining energy drained from the shields. The pounding of the enemy fire was relentless, and Cale's teeth ground together. "We have to make it," he thought, but he knew better than to believe in simple wishes. This wasn't about luck, it was about willpower. And right now, they needed every ounce of it. The ship dropped again, this time far too quickly, as Riker slammed his palm onto the console. "We've got a breach. The lower engine's gone. We're flying on fumes." A sharp blast sent a jagged ripple through the hull, throwing Cale forward. He caught himself on the controls, teeth gritted, and forced his breath to steady. The transport was losing its integrity. "Focus," he told himself. There was no room for panic now. "We're running on fumes, but we're not done yet," Cale said through clenched teeth. "Hold tight, everyone. We're getting to that generator, even if we have to walk there." From the rear, Kira's voice rang out, tinged with sarcasm but also an unshakable resolve. "No need to worry about walking. We'll get there. Don't you worry about us, Commander." Cale gave a tight smile, but his eyes never left the approaching battle. The land beneath them was rocky and barren, nothing but scorched earth as far as the eye could see. It was desolate, devoid of life, save for the brutal presence of the Valor's war machines on the horizon. "We're in range," Kira said as the ship shuddered again, this time with the deep roar of a landing thruster firing up. "Get ready." The transport's engines screamed in protest as they slammed into the hard ground, a cacophony of screeching metal and dust filling the air. Cale braced himself as the ship bounced, tires scraping against jagged rocks. The ship lurched one final time, then settled with a shuddering groan. For a moment, everything was silent. No enemy fire, no sound of battle, just the ringing in his ears and the harsh breathing of his team. Then Kira's voice cut through the quiet. "We've got company." From the dust cloud that had billowed from the impact, 3 alien sentinels emerged, their hulking, armored forms massive against the barren landscape. They were the vanguard of the Valor forces, unstoppable war machines made of dark, iridescent metal. Each one carried weapons capable of shredding entire battalions in seconds. Riker cursed under his breath. "They know we're here." Cale didn't flinch. His mind raced through the options, but there was only one. "We've got a clear path to the generator if we move now. Get ready to move out." "We need to hold them off, Commander," Kira interjected, checking the loadout on her rifle. "You know what happens if we don't." Cale looked at her, his eyes narrowing. Kira had a point. They couldn't afford to let the Sentinels live long enough to alert the Valor fleet of their presence. But time was running out. They had to disable the generator before the fleet realized they had breached the perimeter. "I'll take the lead," Cale said, his tone brokering no argument. "Kira, Riker, get to the generator." "I'll cover you." Riker nodded, hefting his weapon with a grim expression. "We stick together." The transport's hatch swung open, and the wind hit them like a slap. Dust and debris swirled around them, stinging their faces as they stepped onto the hostile soil. Cale's boots crunched against the cracked earth, and his rifle felt like a lead weight in his hands, but he didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, crouching low and weaving through the craters in the landscape. The Valor Sentinels were closing in, their heavy steps echoing in the tense silence. Kira and Riker moved silently, focused on the task at hand. Cale stayed behind them, his eyes scanning the horizon, every sense on high alert. Without warning, the first Sentinel fired, its plasma cannon lighting up the sky. Cale dove behind cover, the ground shaking under the impact of the blast. His heart thundered in his chest, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to be distracted now. "Kira, Riker, go," he shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. The 2 soldiers sprinted toward the generator, their rifles raised. Cale stood his ground, firing as he ran, his shots striking the Sentinel's armor with sharp bursts of sparks. The creature howled in frustration, turning toward him with a murderous glint in its glowing eyes. The air around them crackled with tension, and Cale's pulse hammered in his ears. He felt the weight of their mission, the crushing responsibility to not only survive but to strike the Valor down, before it was too late. He fired again, aiming for the weak points in the Sentinel's armor. A hit. The creature staggered, but it wasn't enough. "We're not done yet," Cale muttered to himself as the battle raged on. The ground trembled beneath Cale's boots as he fired another round into the Sentinel's exposed joint. The shot ricocheted off the beast's armor, but the damage was minimal. His pulse raced. They had seconds before the enemy would overwhelm them completely. Sweat beaded across his forehead, but he ignored it, his focus unyielding. "We've come this far. We can't back down now. Keep firing." Cale yelled, his voice rough with urgency. Kira and Riker were still sprinting towards the generator, their every move a dance of calculated precision. But even they couldn't run forever. The Valor Sentinels weren't just powerful, they were relentless. The Sentinel he was battling now swung its plasma cannon, and Cale dove behind a jagged rock as a wave of intense heat washed over the air. The ground around him exploded into fragments as the cannon fired. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He could hear the sound of Riker's voice on the comms. 2 clicks to the generator. "We need cover." "I'm on it." Kale barked, popping out of cover for a split second to fire 2 more rounds at the Sentinels' weak points. He was buying them time they desperately needed. Another shot landed, this time striking a joint on the creature's armored leg, sending it stumbling back. But it wasn't enough. The Sentinel wasn't going down without a fight. It turned its massive form toward Kale, its glowing eyes locking onto him like twin lasers. It raised its cannon again, and the familiar dread of impending doom filled Kale's chest. He glanced over his shoulder at Kira and Riker. They were within sight of the generator now, but the path was still open, vulnerable. He had to buy them more time. "Go! I'll hold them off," Kale shouted, a fire igniting in his chest. He didn't wait for an answer, diving back into the fray with renewed purpose. He moved like a shadow, dodging behind boulders and ruins as the Valor shots seared the air around him. The wind stung his face as he fired, his shots precision-targeted but slow in their effectiveness. The Sentinel was too massive. Too armored. Kale's pulse quickened. No more room for error. No time left. He needed a way to end this. His mind raced through every option. He could feel the heat of the battle around him, the thrum of his pulse in his ears. The enemy was closing in, and the moment to make a stand had arrived. "Riker, Kira, get ready to move," Kale shouted, eyes locking onto the weak spot at the Sentinel's lower back. His breath caught in his throat, but there was no hesitation. In a sudden, fluid motion, Kale darted from his cover, dropping to one knee as he fired 2 rapid shots into the weak point. The Sentinel staggered. It howled in anger, but the damage was done. Kale saw the moment he'd been waiting for, the glowing armor cracked, revealing the fragile circuitry beneath. "Now, Riker!" Kale's voice rang out. Riker didn't need any more prompting. He surged forward, rifle raised high as he unloaded a barrage of concentrated fire into the exposed core. Sparks flew, and the Sentinel's massive body shuddered. Its cannon spasmed and fired wildly, but it was too late. The giant crumpled to the ground, its systems overloaded, its lifeless body crashing into the rubble with a thunderous roar. "We're in." Kira's voice crackled through Kale's earpiece. "Heading for the generator." Kale let out a sharp breath and ran toward their position, his legs burning with the effort, but the battle wasn't over yet. He could hear the ominous whine of the remaining Valor forces mobilizing, and he knew the clock was ticking down. Kira and Riker were at the generator, the massive, twisting structure looming over them. It was a labyrinth of alien technology, pulsing with an eerie glow. The hum of power filled the air, but as Kale neared, he saw something that made his heart sink. 2 more Sentinels appeared, emerging from the dust like predators closing in on their prey. "They're not giving up," Kale muttered under his breath. He wasn't surprised. The Valor never did. Kira was already working on the generator, her fingers flying over the alien interface, a look of fierce concentration etched on her face. Riker was crouched low beside her, covering her 6. But time was running out. The Sentinels were advancing. "We need a distraction," Kale said, his mind working overdrive. "We can't take them head-on." Riker's gaze met his, understanding flickering in his eyes. He nodded sharply. "We'll cover you. Go." Without wasting a moment, Kale sprinted toward the new Sentinels, adrenaline pumping through his veins. His rifle barked in his hands, each shot fired with deadly accuracy as he weaved through the battlefield, drawing the Sentinels' attention. They turned their glowing eyes toward him, and for a moment, he felt like a target painted in bright red. But that was the plan. His heart raced as he dodged behind a crumbling wall, barely avoiding the pulse of fire that streaked past him. The Sentinels fired again, their shots heavy and precise, but Kale was faster. He moved in a blur, firing from cover, forcing them into a predictable pattern. Meanwhile, Kira and Riker were making their final push. He could see them working together, tearing through the interface of the generator's defenses. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet, Kale couldn't afford to look back. Every breath he took was a calculation of survival. A final roar erupted from one of the Sentinels as its internal systems overloaded, sparks and smoke pouring from its body. But there was still one left. And that one wasn't stopping. Kale! Riker's voice cut through the chaos. We've got it. The generator's down. Kale didn't hesitate. He turned and ran back toward them, the remaining sentinel on his tail. He could hear its steps growing closer, the thrum of its engines shaking the ground. There was no more time. The fight was theirs, or it wasn't.